Bosses of Reddit. Have you ever experienced an employee not showing up randomly for days on end and only to discover they died unexpectedly? How did you find out? My dad worked with this guy. He was never late, never called in, and he didn't show up to work. No call, no show in the casino means they fire you. His family all lived out of state, so 3 days later his landlord checked on him because he was late with the rent, and he never was late with his rent. He was dead. His family tried to get his life insurance, but it was cancelled due to him being fired. The casino tried to say he had to call in if he missed work. No exceptions. I guess being dead is merely a slight inconvenience and you still need to call in to work. Special place in heck for people like that. There was a gentleman at the restaurant I used to work at. He was kind of a terrible server and I didn't really like working with him. But he was a super nice guy. I was working in another part of the country when this happened. But apparently he didn't show up to his shift one morning, which people just thought typical. Then he didn't show up to his night shift either. It turns out a stray bullet killed him while he was getting pizza when a gang fight broke out a couple blocks from our work. Poor dude. That's a crappy way to go. This was back in 2006. I had hired 3 people for phone sales positions. 1 girl, 2 guys. The girl never showed up first day or day after. Got a call from her mother 4 days later that she and the husband had died in a freak head-on collision not a mile away from the job site. She was only 18. That was probably the worst phone conversation I've had to have with someone. The company accountant was a very quiet, older guy, very reliable, very meticulous, as all good accountants are. The first unnotified day off was a surprise, but we didn't check up until the 2nd or 3rd. Had no close family or friends. We were actually the ones to have the police investigate his house. He died of a heart attack alone in his home. That's so sad. Poor guy. Something I can answer. I manage our location social media among other things. One day we get a Facebook IM from a tenured employee. I told you I was sick. Now I am dead. Perplexed. I call the guy, and his son answered. Apparently part of his will was to send us a Facebook message. Co-worker, not boss. I was one of the few people at this restaurant who didn't do drugs. Most just did weed, but a few did hard stuff. This guy was always showing up early, even volunteering for double shifts. One day he didn't show up, then another 2 days. Boss calls him and tells him he's fired. He didn't answer. Next day read the newspaper. This guy was very high. Tried to rob a house of a military vet. Got shot. Worked in retail heck. We had an old guy that took every shift ever. Basically, management started relying on him. Boss lady tells me to call and ask why the frick Otis hasn't come into work. I called the number he gave us. A man picks up and says Otis died last night. I tell my boss. She asks can he still come in? It took me 20 minutes to explain to her that he died. He passed away, no longer with us. Every time she just kept asking him to come in. It finally sunk. We need someone to pick up his shifts. Can his son come pick them up? When I said that was probably illegal, she looked at me and asked if I wanted to work 80+ hours that week. Keep in mind, retail heck, no overtime, holiday pay, or breaks. They often forgot about breaks. I said no because I had school. They asked me why I dropped out yet. After that, I just said I quit and walked out. Last thing I heard as I was walking out is management asking if Otis can come in. That old man had balls of steel. We used to call him Spartacus because we are pretty sure he was a gladiator in some ways. My father's co-worker didn't show up for work one day. Later that night they saw on the news that her boyfriend killed her and tried to kill himself. My dad was devastated. They were super close and he even knew the boyfriend. I was dating the personnel director at the time and we both worked for the same company but in different capacities. It was the early 1980s, so no cell phones back then. There was a factory worker who, for years, was always dependable, on time, didn't take days off, etc. Then he doesn't show up for work for 2-3 days without any notice. My girlfriend, the HR director, was calling him several times a day but he never answered his phone. She got worried and decided to go to his home and she asked me to go with her. It was in the evening and dark when we got there. He lived on the 2nd floor of a house converted to a 2-flat. We could see there were lights on upstairs, but there was no response to our ringing the bell. We got a ladder from a next door neighbor and I climbed up to the window where we saw the light. When I got up there I could see the gentleman laying on the bathroom floor. I could see he was slightly swollen and obviously deceased even from a distance of about 20 feet. At that point we called the police. We didn't know how to get in touch with the landlord, so the cops called a locksmith to drill out the lock. We fully expected there would an awful stench, but there wasn't, even though the heat had been on and he'd been dead for at least 3 days. Bottom line, he had been sitting on the toilet reading a newspaper and he had a heart attack and fell off the toilet with his pants around his ankles. Even to this day I think about that every once in a while and hope that if I die alone, that's not how they find me. I was a shift manager at a video store and we had a guy that worked there as a second job, just trying to get some extra money until his main job picked up a bit. He stopped coming in one day and I just assumed he had quit. A week or so later his sister brought in some DVDs he'd had in his apartment and said that he had died in his sleep apparently. She didn't even know he worked there, just saw that he had videos and wanted to return them. Dude was maybe late 20s early 30s and it was completely unexpected. One of my employees was late for her shift, and since she'd had a rough couple of weeks lately, we figured she'd quit without notice. About an hour later we get a call from the hospital because she'd run into a tree on the way to work and they couldn't find any emergency contact information for her. She was in a coma for a few weeks, and when she woke up, she had no memory of the last year and a half. Since she'd been working for us about 8 months, for her it was like we never existed. She came into the store about 6 months later and didn't know any of us or anything about working there. She didn't die, at least, but in some ways it still felt like it. That is crazy. I find this more interesting than any of the death stories. Sad, especially if any of the employees had become good friends with her while she worked there. Not me, but my dad. He's a manager at a factory and had a worker who hadn't come in for work in a few days. He finally decided to go to his house to see if he was alright. He went to the house, but then went inside after he smelled something disgusting. Both the worker and his girlfriend had overdosed on H and had just been rotting for days. This is the first comment I read where the manager gets in contact with the intent of seeing if the employee is okay. Every other manager seems not to care and just called to say you're fired without bothering to see if something bad happened. Story from my boss. He hired a new kid and he was going great. One day buddy didn't show up, so he called his house to find out where he is. He thought maybe he slept in a whatnot. Nope. Kid got run over by a dump truck driving his bicycle to work that morning. I had an employee who was always reliable, on time for shifts, and if he wasn't coming in, he always texted or called me. Without fail. He didn't show up one Tuesday last year, and I didn't get any texts or calls from him. I had a bad feeling but shrugged it off after a few attempts to get in contact. Finally, my last text to him was, "Hey, I'm not mad and you're not gonna be in trouble. Just call me when you get the chance to explain what's going on." Kid didn't show up for work the next day either, and I still hadn't heard from him. I told my boss, and he just dismissed it, saying he was sure the kid would get in touch when he could. That's when the bad feeling kicked into overdrive. The next morning, the kid's father came in and I was the only manager in the store and introduced himself, and my heart dropped. I asked if the employee was okay, and his father said no, they had lost him the other day. He was 25. Heart attack. I had to be the one to tell everyone. My boss, my other manager, all of my employees. It was a rough day. I used to be a manager at an auto parts store, and every day I would see the signs on the freeway telling people to be careful and how many road fatalities had happened that year so far. Well, there was this girl that worked with me, and she was nice but not very dependable. We cut her slack because of the whole single mom thing though. Well, she had just gotten a new boyfriend with a motorcycle a couple weeks before, and she told me about the date they had planned for the evening. The next day she doesn't show up. I figured that she was hungover and not feeling too hot, so I just whatevered it for the moment. A couple hours later her mom comes in and tells me she died early that morning when the bike wrecked. Her boyfriend was in critical condition. I was able to verify with the news story on my phone, but it wasn't real to me until I was driving home and saw the road fatalities counter had gone up by 1. Similar story. I had a friend die in a car accident when his cousin, who was driving while high, backed out of the driveway and was T-boned by a dump truck. Killed my friend on impact. The accident was on the 2nd of January. He was the third road fatality, as far as I could tell. My cousin died of an asthma attack. He'd been jogging, without his inhaler. Someone found him on their lawn near a jogging trail. He was a teacher. His principal went to his apartment to check up on him, then checked the police station. Nothing. Then just on a hunch, he called the morgue. There he was. No on him. Don't know how long it would have taken to get to his body if his principal hadn't made it personal. Whoa, this is really sad. Sorry for your loss. My ex-BF worked in a metal fabrication shop. One of the guys that worked there had just broken up with his GF and decided to move back to his hometown in another province. A few months later the company called the ex-GF asking for his current address so they could send him some tax forms. She told them that he had died in a car accident, killed by a drunk driver a few weeks ago. They held a small memorial and made a plaque in his name and put it on the wall. Everyone was very sad because he was such a good guy. About 8 months later the dead guy showed up at the shop for a visit. Everyone was beyond shocked. I guess his ex was just a lying weirdo that just wished he was dead. Imagine being that guy and returning to find this little shrine for you there, lol. He must have thought they really liked him. I was very nearly the employee in this scenario. Biking into work one day I was run over by a truck and hospitalized for a month. My boss found out because I missed dinner with my mom and she called him the next Saturday morning. He was in the hospital that day. Good boss. I'm responding to this a bit late now, so I expect it'll get buried, but this happened to me this past January. We had this employee, Jay, from Poland. He was always a bit of a nightmare to manage because he was always on the booze. He'd never drink in work, but as soon as he got home he'd go and get pee. This led to many hangovers and him getting into stupid, although often hilarious, situations and coming into work the worse for wear. He also had a heart condition discovered just a few months before. He was always up and down with his moods, so much so that we'd suspected he had undiagnosed depression. Obviously there were other signs, but he had often called one of the managers in the middle of the night crying or upset and on the edge of harming himself. When Jay missed a shift due to his antics, he was always quick to message or call and let us know what happened and why he'd gone AWOL. As he was amazing at his job though, and in an awful place personally, we'd kept him on. Come Boxing Day he didn't turn up for his shift. He called us the next day to explain he'd supposedly had food poisoning and that was why he wasn't in. This was the final straw for my boss and he put him on a final warning. Jay was due to work the 2nd of January. New Year's Day is a public holiday in the UK and had the preceding 2 days off beforehand. He never showed up to his shift on the 30th of December. Because he liked to drink, we all assumed he'd been on a bender and was hungover. At this point he was all but sacked. I went into work by accident on the 2nd of January, read the wrong week's rota, and saw that he still wasn't in. He hadn't contacted anyone in all that time, which was also out of character. I decided to swing by his place to see if he was alright. Because he hadn't updated his personal details, I didn't have his house number, just his housing estate. Ended up walking around for over 2 hours on that estate looking for him, asking if anyone knew him. Finally met an old lady who knew who he was. She took me to his flat. The front door was locked, so I tried the back and it was open. There he was, dressed in his PJs. He'd been dead for 3 days. Called the police, gave statements etc. Turned out to have been heart failure. He was 32. Good on you for the one person who cared enough to investigate. We had a lesser manager get into a horrible car accident. She swerved into the other lane on an undivided highway. We didn't know for a couple days. Eventually it was in the paper. A few of us think it was intentional. She was going through a lot at the time, but it's a subject that we agree to never bring up. He is going to home. I'm not a boss, but my friend from trade school finally got hired, and it turned out he got hired where I was working. I was stoked to see him. He didn't come in one day and everyone was like, where is he? Turns out the dude had really bad sleep apnea and legitimately suffocated in his sleep. We found out because his wife called to let us know. I get so bad for the guy because he had a really hard life and he was so motivated to do well. Yup, Guy I worked with was in his mid-50s and had some health problems related to his years of alcoholism. He had a tendency of not showing up some days because of it. We had a long weekend and he didn't show up on Tuesday. No big deal. Thursday rolls around and still nothing. Friday morning our director goes to his place. He lived alone in a rundown trailer by a nearby lake. Dead as can be. Not the boss, but worked at a place where this happened. We'll call the girls Kathy and Maggie. Kathy didn't show up for her shift. Maggie was P because she had vouched for Kathy when she was getting hired and they were friends from way back. The next day Maggie comes in looking like she has been crying all day. Kathy had killed herself as it turns out. I remember hearing Maggie say that Kathy's dad was physically abusive and that he got away with it because he was a high-ranking officer in the local PD. Unfortunately, we'll never know her reasons because the note she left was destroyed by all the blood. Something tells me it wasn't the blood that destroyed the note. Ours is a construction trade business. Had a guy who didn't really fit the mold, but hey, if they show up and do work I'm pretty happy. So this guy was around for about 6 months, always on time, always seemed to be motivated, smiling etc. So this guy just fell off. No answer on the phone, text, email. For a week radio silence. I get a call from his wife. Apparently the guy had tried to off himself. He was recovering in the hospital. So I asked the wife if she knew why and she said one of my other employees was being quite unkind to him etc etc. Asked the other employee what had happened and God dropped a hammer on my shoulder from the top of a ladder. And it's not the first stupid thing he has done, so I laid into him. When he didn't show up I figured good riddance. If he can't handle getting his butt chewed for being a jackass he doesn't belong here anyway. So that's my almost had an employee die story. Got a call from a relative. His landlord found him because he hadn't paid his rent. He was very sick. It was not unexpected. I still get random spam from his Gmail account every once in a while. It's not spam. He's communicating with you from beyond the grave. This happened to one of my bosses. The guy was an excellent worker that never missed a day in hostel life. All of a sudden he doesn't show up for a week and a half. My boss called his house. He was actually homeless, but stayed with his sister, and was informed that he passed away. We all signed a card offering our condolences. That was a rough time for all of since he was such a great guy. Not a boss, but I teach classes on how to use our software to higher ups in the medical field. I had these two really charming doctors in one of my classes, and was happy to see them back in my section for the second class of the course. On the first day of the next class only one of the doctors was there, saving a seat for his buddy. I asked where the doc 2 was and he didn't know. I was worried that I wouldn't be able to give the missing doc credit and that it would mess up his traveling. Might have to come back. The next day, the first doc came in visibly shaken and said that after arguing with the hotel, they finally opened Doc 2's room. Doc 1 had been calling and knocking with no answer, and they found him dead in his hotel room. I tried to get Doc 1 to leave class and go take care of himself. He just found his friend co-worker dead, but he insisted on sitting in class as a distraction. It was quite surreal. I understand mourning that way. It was something they signed up for together. Manager of a car wash here. Just got out of winter and back into spring, so we need bigger staff to handle the increase in numbers. Kid applied. Seemed good enough. Well motivated. But couldn't get his I-9 together, so it delayed hiring. After about a week of trying to call him, we find out the number he gave us is his girlfriend's number, and she screened us for whatever reason. Finally his aunt comes up and informed me that he hanged himself over a breakup with his girlfriend and complications getting a job. I was shocked. He was so happy and eager, and I totally would have hired him if he could get his documents ready. Still weirds me out that his ex goes to our wash regularly with a new man and seemingly no sadness even days after. I often wonder if she even knew. She knew. I am a supervisor at a major auto factory. Had an electrician not show up after lunch. Hour later had to shut one of the lines down because one of the lifts was leaking a really nasty thick oil. Called maintenance over. Missing electrician decided to tighten some bolts on the lift before going to lunch without locking and tagging out the machine. Operator not seeing the electrician hit machine reset as he went to lunch, sending the electrician up on the lift into the rafters, smashing him into goo. It was awful. We were all working feeling smelling the oil from the leak because we couldn't identify it. It was the guy. Still haunts me. Had to go stop his wife from coming in the plant too. Worst day of my life. Holy crap. Safety is no joke, especially around industrial equipment. I worked at a grocery store a few years ago. One morning, one of my co-workers' parents called the store and said her son worked there and wouldn't be showing up for his shift later that day, or ever. He had committed suicide the night before right after work. I never got the full story. The supervisors wouldn't let us talk or gossip about it. That's understandable, but I couldn't help but wonder because I had just worked with him the night before and then the next minute he was gone. I think he was only like 20 years old. My sister was in medical college and was to start with the autopsy. As the students started gathering around, the attendants took the body out of the container. When they removed the cover from the dead body, one of the students started freaking out and crying. Turns out it was her dad that was missing for a year. She quit the college the same day and took the body with her. We had a young lady pregnant with her second child die in a car accident one night on her way home from her shift. She left about midnight and it was rainy. I was managing at the time, but in the mornings, she didn't not show up though. Her family called that morning to let us know. I got to answer that call, then informed my superior and the staff, and talked to her grieving grandparents later when they came to ask some questions. Suck. Her fifth son was only 1. Her and her husband were basically still newlyweds. Not dead, but close. Working in PNG and a security guard didn't turn up for about a week. When he finally did, I asked him why he had been absent and he knew our rules about calling in if something was wrong. He simply lifted his cap and showed me the fresh scar running across his scalp from a bush knife. Okay, Bill. All okay now? Yep. Okay, head back to work. I might seem callous, but this wasn't unusual. Had a lady working for us who seemed not quite her chipper self at work. I asked if everything was okay. She replied, "Sorry boss, just tired." I inquired further and she then informed me her village got attacked in the middle of the night and she had to grab her kids and run into the bush and hide for most of the night. And yes, she turned up for work that morning. They are tough people. Old guy that used to work at my shop just suddenly stopped coming in. No call, didn't answer his phone, nothing. And this was after 20 something years of employment here. We all thought he died, but it turned out he retired down to Florida without telling anyone. Kind of a dong move, but I guess he just said frick it, I'm out. New Florida man not actually dead, just a dong. Not employee but coworker. Maybe not relevant, but I need to tell the story. He was a really nice guy, enthusiastic about tinkering with cars and trying to invent things. He had a project going to build a diesel-powered pogo stick. But he was also into drugs and going to raves. He was a good worker but hung out with a crowd of deadbeats. He never tried to pick up women, but women loved him and he had trouble saying no. Even though he'd be going steady with a nice girl, he'd always get involved with another and then have to deal with all the trouble after they found out about each other. We were making okay money, but he was always broke. Because he was so generous, he started having depression, turning up to work and just crying. He ended up in a psychiatric hospital for a while. Our company used to be pretty good with time off for illness. When he came back to work, he asked for redundancy and our boss let him have it as they were looking to let people go. He left with a year's wages, about £23,000 at the time. He came back and did a few days freelance for us. He never invoiced for it as he was so disorganized. The office girls felt so sorry that they did his invoices and made sure he got paid. After 6 months he confided to me that all his severance money was gone. One day at work he was acting really strangely. As we were going home, someone had left their car with the keys in while they were waiting for someone. He got in and drove it away and took about an hour before he came back. We weren't due to see him again for a few days, but when that came around he didn't show, or the day after. 2 people went round to his house to see if he was okay, but found him sitting unconscious in his car in the garage. The engine had been running until it ran out of fuel. They called the ambulance and police, but it was too late. It was a really bad time for everyone, as he was well liked. We all felt so helpless. Thanks for sharing. It's relevant. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.